Okay, well, today's topic is, one of the most difficult topics in dealing with Calvin, or really dealing with Christianity in general, and that's the topic of predestination. And so, let me jump to where Calvin begins to discuss this. He discusses the doctrine of eternal election. And he says, the gospel is not preached to everyone, and among those to whom it is preached, does not always meet with the same response. This difference demonstrates the unsearchable depths of divine judgment and is subordinate to God's purpose of eternal election. If we suggest that salvation is offered to some and not others simply to suit God's pleasure, enormous question marks arise. These questions are unanswerable unless we hold correct views on election and predestination. Now, he says this is a puzzling subject to many because it's hard to square the thought of some men being predestined to salvation and others to destruction. I hope to show that they are needlessly confused. In the very complexity of the matter, we can discern the outcomes of the doctrine and its happy outcome. We will never be convinced as we ought that salvation flows from God's free mercy until we understand eternal election. God's grace is illustrated by the fact that he does not give away salvation indiscriminately. He gives to some, but he denies to others. And so, one of the things we have to try to understand is actually what this discussion is about. It becomes incredibly tangled, incredibly complicated. There is a huge debate about all of this stuff. There are many different positions. It's easy to get involved in discussions of supralapsarianism, infralapsarianism, and all sorts of other details. And so it's very hard to keep your eye on the ball. And indeed, I think Calvin says a lot of things that sort of go back and forth. It's hard to put them together. And indeed, whether Calvin himself was, well, what exactly his doctrine is still a matter of scholarly dispute. So let's try to identify what I think of as the core issue. The core issue is one that we described earlier as justification. Or let's put it sort of baldly as a question of salvation. There's a religion here that says you can have eternal life, okay? But now it's natural to say, well, what do I have to do to get this? And so we can think about what is required to do this. And then there are different models of this that arise. That depends on what? So let's think of it this way. Salvation depends on, and now, you might say, it's a question of how you fill in that blank. So what are possible ways of filling in the blank? What could you say? Yeah?
Your election through ethnicity. Say, in Jewish theology, because they were the chosen people.
Ah, okay. So yes, there are lots of possible answers here. Here's one: membership in the tribe. Okay, that's a sort of tribal answer. By the way, notice there are a number of analogies I want to exploit today, and one of them is one that's utterly familiar to you as students. What do I have to do to get an A in this course? Okay? That's what you might think. What do I have to do to get an A in Christianity, right? What do I have to do? Well, all right, this is what it is. We're going to try. So this might be, well, this isn't obviously the case in our modern classrooms, but suppose I am a shaman in some tribe somewhere, and I say, here's what you must do to pass my class. You must be a member of the tribe. Okay? And so an anthropologist comes in and tries to understand this, and so tries to take my class. Anthropologist, in fail. Why? Because you're not member of tribe. Okay, so anyway, it might be something like that. And that membership might be defined in all sorts of ways. So that could be one way of thinking about this. What are other possible answers? Yeah?
It could be purely the grace of God.
It could be purely, yes, exactly. It might depend on God's choice alone. Here's another. I mean, here would be one way of thinking of that. Who gets an A? Whoever I choose. Okay? Yeah, in that context, that's hard to understand. But here's an analogy that might be helpful. Calvin talks frequently about adoption. What happens is that God adopts us. Or adopts, well, some people anyway, adopts the elect. Now, on what basis? Imagine that you go down to the animal shelter. You're going to pick out a cat. Okay? You pick one out. That cat gets it gets benefits that the other cats don't get. Now, why? Well, it pleases you to adopt that cat. Are there criteria? maybe you have criteria, but the cat doesn't know what they are, right? It's not like the cat thinks, okay, what do I have to be chosen by Jake here, for example? Well, yeah, I know Jake likes this and likes that and so on, and I better, leave myself. I mean, no, the cat has no concept of what Jake wants in a cat, so the cat's just doing its thing. Jake picks out the cat. From the cat's point of view, the reasons for this, if there are any, are utterly unintelligible. It may be that there are reasons, maybe there aren't, right? Maybe Jake just goes in and says, "Whoa, you're influence." And he can't explain why your influence somehow leaks out of him. So in any case, it might be God's choice. Now there are two variants of this as soon as we can think about this. One is to say, well, God's choice on the basis of something or on the basis of nothing, right? There might be, in other words, this could be purely arbitrary. It might be that Jake comes in and just says, "That's the cat for me," and there's no real reason he can give for that. Or maybe there's some kind of reason. But then if there's a reason, there are two possibilities. It might be one that is known, or it might be unknown. So, it might be, for example, that cat is adopted for a reason, and maybe the cat is capable of knowing what it is. Maybe that cat's smart enough to think, human beings like it when we purr. And so he comes in and the cat goes, and the cat knows the reason it's chosen. Or it might be that the cat has no idea, right, and not even capacity to know. So maybe it would be better, in fact, to replace known and unknown with knowable and unknowable. Now here I don't mean for God, to go back to what we were introducing the analogy before, but to us. So it might be that God's choice is purely arbitrary. It's just God's own pleasure. It might be that there's a reason. And maybe we're capable of knowing what the reason is, maybe not. Okay, what else could we say? Yeah?
This usually is sacraments, but in Catholic theology, there's the caution is bound by a sacrament, so there's a baptismal desire, which is for people who have never heard the gospel, or like for those who don't really know, and it's if you just like live in accordance with your conscience, you're sort of already on your way to salvation.
Okay, yes, good. So there are two things in what you said. One, there might be sacraments. There might be specific things you have to do, like show up for the final exam to take the course. That's like a sacrament. In fact, and of course, if you don't show up, then, well, yeah, you sort of miss out. So this can be the case with things that are officially designated as sacraments. Or, and this brings me to the other thing in what you said, it might have to do with what you do, your actions. Okay, often this is expressed in terms of good works. And we can think of it more generally as what you do. So, for example, in Denmark, there is actually, the church is supported by the state. And there's a tax. It's a voluntary tax, but there's a place in the tax form, which is the church tax. You may pay it, or you may not. Okay, it's sort of like our election fund thing. On the 1040, it's like you want $3 to go to the election fund. And I always say no, I think it's spending it on when they start publishing philosophical essays instead of appearing on TV in stupid ways, then I will contribute $3. But anyway, there's something like that in Denmark. You pay the church tax. What's interesting is that, well, very few people in Denmark actually go to church. It doesn't seem to be a very religious place. On the other hand, almost everyone pays the church tax. And I was talking to somebody about this, and I said, well, if you've never go to church, and you weren't really a believer, why? He says, well, I don't want to take any chances. It's like, why insult God? I don't really believe in God, but just in case, right? It's only a couple of bucks. I'll cover my bases. So it might be like that. Now, of course, it might be that there's a high standard here, and so there are all sorts of different levels at which this might be relevant. I mean, you might think, okay, I'll pay the church tax. Or you might think, well, I should show up. Or maybe you think, no, look, I really have to go far. I have to fulfill the law. Or maybe I have to go far above and beyond fulfilling the law. And so on. So there's a complicated set of criteria that one might develop for what's really involved here. And they might be minimal, and they might be very extensive. What are other things that might contribute to this?
add to what Jacqueline said about sacraments, just to help people in preparation for it. In some ways, what she was describing with sacraments or conscience is what is Occam's position. Like, Occam's position is you do what's in you, but that doesn't earn you salvation. So this actions difference is a matter of earning. The kind of sacraments, conscience, it's a reliance upon God's grace. God chooses to help you, but he chooses to help you in part because you've done what was in you. You've taken advantage of the sacraments if they were available to you. You followed your conscience if that's all you had.
Good. So yes, this might be, actually we can interpret this, in other words, in a sort of external sense. You're doing these things, or in an internal sense. You're sort of doing what you can do in the right frame of mind. And this becomes a complicated topic, really. You can talk a lot about theories of baptism, about theories of communion, and so on. There's a huge amount that gets discussed at the Reformation time, and this is debated intensely. So you're absolutely right. There can be sort of external views of this, there can be internal views of this, there can be all sorts of roles that the sacraments play. From some points of view, the point of view, or rather the purpose of baptism is really to just remove the stain of original sin. And so it's in a sense something that has to be done in an external way, but it's not that it's a positive thing, it's really just sort of a guard against a negative thing. And so there are lots and lots of things that need to be distinguished at this level to be right, or to get a view that's really coherent. Now, there are a couple of other things that I'm hearing in what you're saying. One is, look, this is an external thing. This might be interpreted externally or internally. You might think what really matters is some internal state. Right? What kind of internal state would be required? Yeah, faith? Faith, okay, good. So you might say it's really faith. Now, what does faith mean? Yeah?
Some people believe that if you just say a certain prayer, you are saved, or you just, believe.
Okay, okay, good. One thing this might mean is belief, right? So maybe faith is just belief. Belief in what exactly? How detailed does it have to be? Actually, the Catholic Church has certain things you have to believe, and then other things that are optional. And so if you look at the Catholic Catechism, for example, and by the way, almost all the Protestant churches by now have such mushy statements of faith that if you actually have hard theological questions, they're just no help. You have to go back to like the 17th and 18th century for them to actually give you real content. But the Catholic Catechism still does. However, look at the real Catholic Catechism, not the American Catechism. The American one has come down basically somewhere. I don't know. Their view must be Americans are they can't follow this serious distinction. So I'm going to say very vague and general things. But really give you. And anyway, certain things are like, all right, here's the position of the church. You're supposed to believe this. And then in other places they say, this is a hard question. And so here are different options that people can acceptably take. So it might be a very, very general thing. It might be a highly detailed thing. Well, what else could it be? It could be a question of practice. And here I don't mean external practice, which would get us to the level of actions, but I really mean a spiritual practice. Okay, so for example, prayer. An attitude of reverence. It's, from this point of view, a practice of, well, having an internal state of mind. And that's not to be identified just with belief, but it's really a whole set of mental practices, mental attitudes. What else could faith be?
Reliance.
Reliance, okay, good. It could be reliance. Sometimes it's expressed as an assurance. So it's a reliance on God. It's an assurance on God's presence. And so that could be what we really mean by faith. Anything else?
Assent to propositions.
How is that different from belief?
That's a good question, because I think belief has been, I think Luther defined faith as the belief as trust, but he was distinguishing those who define belief as assent to propositions.
Okay, yeah. It's hard to draw that distinction. Some philosophers just identify belief with assent to propositions, but here's a way of thinking about the difference. Actually, what springs to mind is the movie Kramer versus Kramer. It's a It's a difficult movie to watch. It's about divorce. It's very painful. But at one point, the wife, about to be ex-wife, is on the stand testifying. And the husband's attorney is questioning, and he says, so you admit that you're a failure in this marriage. And failure as a lover for breaking up your family. Basically, you're admitting that you're a failure in the most important things you've ever done. And the husband is over there, shaking his head, no. But she says yes. Now, it's one thing to, does she believe that? I don't know if she believes that. But she's put on the spot and said, do you assent to the proposition that you're a failure? And she says yes. Okay? So there are times when you might say, look, this is a question. There are many times when you actually have to either mentally or sort of physically commit yourself to something. But at certain points, you do, right? And you might think there are those points that really matter. Like in a court of law. Do you plead guilty or not guilty? You know, that plays a special role. Maybe you really don't think of yourself as guilty, but you get in there and think, oh man, okay, I'm guilty. And so that's one way of thinking of the difference. There might be moments where you're asked to assent or dissent from a proposition, and maybe those moments have a special role, independently of how you're actually thinking about things at the time. Yeah?
It seems like in Catholic practice today, I suppose there's a balance between private conscience and public affirmation. So, and then in a certain way, if you want to go to a political context, it's like when I'm thinking of going into foreign service, and to think about that, you have to balance what you privately believe about U.S. public foreign policy with what you have to publicly support as the State Department official.
Right. Okay, good. So here's assent, and really we can mean here, do we mean mental assent? That there are moments where you're thinking about this, and they're crucial moments, or do we mean something like public assent? Maybe that's what it means. Yeah.
Actually, he's bringing up a really good point, because in the early church, people would always, until you made the public proclamation of baptism, which is why, say for instance, Marius Victorinus wasn't so sure initially, you weren't considered to actually be a Christian, because they couldn't trust that you had belief enough to state your beliefs in public.
Right. So you might think, look, this requires not just a mental, well, maybe you could lie about this, right? And so maybe this doesn't even require mental assent. It's a different thing, but at least it's thought that if you're sincerely publicly assenting, that's something stronger than thinking, okay, in your own mind, that's being willing to make a public declaration, which means, look, I'm willing to back it up. It's one thing to think, that politician's argument makes sense to me. It's another thing to actually stand up and defend that person or argue in favor of that.
In Scripture, I think this is a delineator between, say, someone like the apostles and others like Nicodemus. Or you could even see the division between Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. When Joseph of Arimathea goes publicly and gives presumably his own tomb, because it's empty, to take down Jesus from the cross. Whereas Nicodemus is sort of the person who comes at night, who actually wasn't there at the time of the trial, didn't assent to the condemnation of Jesus, but really was a little more cautious. On the other hand, Nicodemus is counted as a person who believed in secret for fear of the Jews. So he was a believer, but he wasn't like Joseph of Arimathea, who had the courage to actually go and dedicate his tomb to this person publicly.
Right. Excellent. Good. That's a good illustration of the difference between this sort of thing, where one person, is willing to mentally assent, but not publicly. The other willing to presumably do both. Of course, then you've got the complicated example of Peter, who publicly denies Jesus when he's on the spot, and yet otherwise publicly assents by being publicly a follower up to that moment, and so on. So that's one way of indicating, people can vary in this, even when they're not really varying in mental assent, in both sorts of directions. Are there other things we might want to add to this? What do you want to say?
I just want to talk about the assent propositions.
Sure. Go ahead.
You might be forced to assent to a proposition when an argument leads you to a conclusion you don't want. You might have to bite the bullet, and what they they call bite the bullet.
Yes, right. That's true. Yeah, philosophers get familiar with this sort of thing where somebody says, wait, that's your position? Well, then this follows and that follows. And so you believe that? And, there are various ways of trying to get out of it. One response is so-called bite the bullet, say, yes, I do. Okay. So, actually, that happens at an early stage in Christianity with respect to the question of infant baptism. What about the baby who dies before it gets a chance to be baptized? You saying it's condemned to hell? And some people say, yes, I am. Okay, that's chopping on the bullet, basically. Why? The idea is supposed to be, yeah, in the old days before anesthetic, you had to have surgery. They would give you something to bite on, to deal with the pain. And so that's like dealing with the philosophical pain. This absurd thing. Okay, so yeah, you're absolutely right. That there can be varying degrees of willingness to accept the proposition. Yes, I do, but without full mental assurance. But it's still sincere, right? It's not that I'm lying to get out of this. It's rather that really that's a consequence of my new book, right? Okay, yes, I guess I believe that. So that's true. That's an additional sort of variable. I'm not sure exactly what to say about that, except that there is this, biting the bullet problem. There are things that you affirm happily because they're an important part of your view. There are things you affirm even though you have some doubts. There are things you affirm even though you realize, this sounds absurd. I was recently in a philosophical discussion where I ended up doing that. So you think that? Yes.
On the other side of that spectrum would be kind of an openness to the mystery of salvation. So if God is bound by the sacrament or by anything else, it just say we don't really know at the end of person's life, exactly what happened, or if Christ reveals himself to people. And I think the catechism kind of, it doesn't take a very staunch position on exactly what happens.
Right. Right, no, exactly. This is one of the places where the Catholic Church actually allows many different options. Although it's interesting, if you go to the Catholic Encyclopedia, they talk about Calvin's view. They're incredibly dismissive. Like, Calvinists think these absurd things and those absurd things. And then, even though they say they don't believe in these, they surely got to believe in these other absurd things. Talk about biting the bullet. And yet, you're right, the Catechism really allows a number of different attitudes about this. So let's think about what some of the attitudes are. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to add here. It may be something already included in a number of these, but one is simply acceptance. One image that people routinely have is of God granting a gift. Okay, salvation is like a gift. And according to some views, you're given the gift, but you have to accept it. Or to take another metaphor, the hand is reached out to you, but you have to grasp it. And so that may or may not involve actually a belief in some doctrine. It may or may not involve an essential proposition, but it involves an attitude of acceptance. And so it might be that that's the core of faith, really being willing to grasp the hand, being willing to take the gift. And then what you mean by that can be spelled out in a variety of ways that may or may not have connection to these various things. So, let's now think about different positions that one can take about this. You can take, and now it's not really just a multiple choice exam, which one do you choose? You can choose any combination, right? Once I gave Plan 2, they're Plan 2 students, so I thought, well, they can handle a different kind of multiple choice exam. I wanted to give them a multiple choice exam because I wanted to see if anybody was actually doing the reading. So I gave them this multiple choice exam, but I told them every single answer might or might not be true. That is to say, it might be, there are 5 possible answers to each one, and maybe none of them are right. Maybe one of them is right, maybe 2, maybe all 5. It broke their brains. One other time I did something terrible on an exam, actually. I was given by mistake multiple choice forms that had 10 options. And so I thought, that's interesting. I'll write questions with 10 possible answer choices. It was so unbelievably hard. I I mean, it was, the normal length, typically people would be done with it within an hour. People stayed the entire 3-hour time. And they go ahead. In fact, one of the best students I ever had at UT was in that class. She came up to me afterwards and said, I hate you. That was like the most difficult thing I've ever had to do. She was really a good student. 4.0, ended up going to Yale Law School and all of this. She was very, very good. But here's the thing. How many slots do you have in short-term memory? 7. Okay, so if the number of answer choices is 7 or less, you can actually keep them in mind and choose. But if there's more than 7, by the time you get down to the end, you forget what the first ones are. And it's not a question of intelligence or anything else, it's just that's the memory capacity. That's all the memory cells we've got, okay? You can't do it anymore. And so people would read that and it's like, wait, what were the others? And they just keep cycling through it. It was awful. Even I was up there like, wait, I wrote this exam. Wait, Jay, what was B again? It was awful. It took me like an hour and a half to fill it out, even though I wrote it. It was awful. Anyhow, why did I start talking about that? Oh yes, because here you can really take combinations of these, okay? So you might say, well, it's faith and good works. And by faith I mean this, or maybe I mean belief and this kind of practice, or and, So you can really choose any of the options up here, which makes it complicated. And it means that actually we've got, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, well, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Then it's like we've got already 2 of the 13th options, which is somewhere around 8,000. So we've got a little formula for 8,000 possible questions on this question, but in fact there are only a few that people have adopted. Here's an easy way to carve out new theological territory. Come up with one of the roughly 7,996 that says we explored. But anyway, yes, what are some positions that people have taken? Well, first of all, since we're talking about Calvin, what is the Calvinist position? We've seen already an important hint. He says God's grace is illustrated by the fact that he does not give away salvation indiscriminately. He gives to some what he denies to others. He says he is under obligation to no one. Those who try to keep people from the doctrine are unfair to God and man alike, because there is no other way to humble us or make us realize what we owe. There is no other sure ground for confidence. So, he says, God by his eternal and unchanging will determined once and for all those whom he would one day admit to salvation, and those whom he would consign to destruction. His decision about the elect is based on his free mercy, with no reference to human discernment. Equally, those whom he dooms to destruction are shut off from the eternal life by his perfect but incomprehensible judgment. With reference to the elect, God's call and justification are proof of election, which will be completed in glory. The unbelievers are cut off from the knowledge of his name, and sanctification of his spirit, a preview of their coming judgment. I shall not bother to refute some of the stupid ideas meant for a servant for predestination, but only deal with the genuine requirements. So what is his position?
I think God's choice, the unknowable.
I think that's exactly right. Really, it comes down entirely to God's choice, okay? And he makes certain things clear. He says, look, it is not that God has the reason that he knows. In fact, here's a very common solution that we'll elaborate in a minute. It is, yes, God does this, and it's entirely God, but God does it for a reason. And the reason is that he knows what you will freely choose. Basically, this is a monogamous position that says, yeah, God knows what you would do in various circumstances. In particular, even from the beginning of the world, he knows what you will do, and so judges you on the basis of that foreknowledge. So he foreknows this, and moreover, by creating the world in which you will indeed do that, he preordains it. But nevertheless, in that sense, you are predestined. But it's nevertheless because of your free choices later. And then what kinds of free choices? Well, then we've got many of these options about how to explain that. But at any rate, it's because God knows you from the beginning of time. That's not Calvin's view. In fact, he says, look, some imagine that God makes distinctions according to merit from foreknowledge. He gives the adoption of sons to the worthy and condemns those who are bent on evil. He says this view obscures the doctrine of election and gives it a different origin. So he says God has always been free to shower his grace on whoever he wants to. Men just might as well question, why they're superior to ox and ass. Only God knows the reason. So, yes, it's perfect. I think he doesn't want to say it's purely arbitrary, though some critics think of it that way. I think the view is it is entirely, he seems to be saying, God's choice. It's presumed to be for an unknowable reason. So this is one of the mysteries. God elects some, doesn't like others. Why? It's like Jake going down to the pound and adopting a cat. Why? Why the cat's asked? Right? That cat thinks, why me? The other cat says, why? Yeah, why her? They aren't capable of knowing the reason, even though there might be. Yeah.
You know, sometimes Calvin is depicted as believing in what's called double predestination, which is that he plans to damn some and to save some from the very foundation of the world. But you'll notice that Calvin's been setting us up all along to say, it's easy to believe in God, but a lot of people don't. It's easy to know what the right thing is, but we still don't do it. We have this knowledge, but we still... And so he's kind of trying to emphasize that God justly ought to condemn all of us. But I like your kitten example, but he just picks up a few kittens and says, I'm going to save these at least. Right. And so it's not exactly, I mean, you might then come back and say, well, that's double predestination because he foreknew that these people were going to not choose him, but that's not necessarily Calvin's position. His position is more of a, okay, I can't save all of them, I'm just going to save as many as I can.
Right, good, I agree with you. Sometimes he sounds as if he's advocating this doctrine of double predestination, and certainly many of his followers do. But I think you're absolutely right. His view, to get the analogy right, we have to imagine that you're going to a weird pound where there are a lot of evil kittens. Okay. It's like they're evil mean kittens, and they're fighting and scratching everybody, and they're like, yeah, maybe none of them deserve to be saved, but nevertheless, right, you go down and adopt one. And because you adopt it and work with it and tame it, it then becomes a good cat. So you have to imagine that. So this is the sort of pound of last resort, the pound where they send all the kittens who are like so vicious they don't actually want to touch them enough to put them in cages. Sorry, yeah, this is a pretty stretched analogy. Maybe you're adopting a Tasmanian devil. Yeah.
Say, to a lot of people who would advocate, Calvin's followers and double predestination, like myself, it doesn't make a lot of sense to advocate only a single predestination, because then you go back to the question of, okay, well, if they're all evil kittens and you're going to save some, why didn't you save all? So then you end up with, a question of, did you just not have the ability to save all, or was it you chose not to save all?
Good.
And you end up having to make a choice of you couldn't or you didn't. And
right.
Either way, you can't go the you couldn't route, because that doesn't work with God and being, omniscient and omnipotent. But then if you go with the didn't route, that's double predestination.
Right. Okay, good. This points out another way in which that analogy isn't quite right, which is that Jake goes down and picks out a cat, but he didn't put the cats there, right? It's not like he said, I'm gonna breed a bunch of really evil cats. And then it says, but in God's case, it's like, wait a minute. God did create this world. God did create those people, right? And so, indeed, God created this nature. And so, in the cat case, it's going to be sort of like, oh yes, there are all these depraved creatures, but you're going to be able to, if God is all powerful, why can't God save them all? This is the reason I try to avoid animal pounds, because if I go, I just bring them all home. And so, it's like, yeah, why doesn't God do that? And moreover, God was the one who created these creatures. At least I didn't create those cats. But God did create the world with all those people, right? So from that point of view, it's like, wait, this... And indeed, those Calvinists tend to think, Luther, for example, who advocates the doctrine of single predestination, is just trying to soft sell it. He's trying to say, like, look, it's not God's fault that you're evil. I don't mean you in particular, you all, everybody, right? Me too. But God is going to, nevertheless, give some of you this free gift. It's kind of like, yeah, suppose you're adopting a child. You can't adopt every child. And so some child gets adopted into this sort of free gift. But now notice, you say, but yeah, then you've got this problem. God creates the world. God gives us that nature. And moreover, God's all powerful, so why can't? So in short, the advocates of double predestination say, look, in the end, that's really not a tenable position, given that God is all powerful, and given that God is responsible in some sense causally for creating us with the nature we have. Yeah.
I was just saying, it goes back to the problem of, okay, well, Luther advocates the position of single predestination, but he yet says, okay, well, God doesn't, he's offering this to some. The question to any kind of Calvinist, single or double predestination is, well, why is it to some? The double predestination, someone who advocates double predestination could say, well, he chooses to elect some and not others. They have that position. The single person is just like, oh, let's not answer that question. There doesn't seem to be a logical answer.
Okay, well, good, yeah. Okay.
Well, I mean, the thing about Luther or Augustine, or even say someone like Occam, is that the single predestination is a cooperation. So God, and so it could have a molinist view. God foreknows, and so he specifically starts pursuing. But first of all, Christ's atonement is supposed to be enough to cover everyone's sins, and then there's not complete free will in the sense of you can choose everything, but you can at least the belief with those who hold a kind of a consistent single predestination is that there's enough in human nature that you can choose to take the medicine. That's really there's enough in human nature that that makes us all culpable, in the sense that if you choose not to take the medicine, either by not obeying your conscience or by not receiving with faith God's gift, then God's just condemning.
Okay, yes, we'll come back to you. Yeah.
Then that goes against another one of Calvin's doctrines, which is the eye in his tulip, or irresistible grace. That if God has elected you, there's no going back from that. It's not, God elects you and then you can turn back off the light and say no thanks.
Good. So here is...
You got to pick and choose on that.
Exactly. Here's a variant which is put forward by Arminius, and so it's known as the Arminian view. It's the view of most Baptists. So some Baptists are Calvinists, but most Baptists have the Arminian view. And probably today most Protestants actually are Arminians, I'm not sure. But in any case, it goes like this, basically. It is, it's God's choice, then plus what? Well, plus something like acceptance. There is some degree of cooperation involved, and that cooperation involves receiving the gift, grasping the hand, or something like that. It doesn't necessarily... Now, typically, both the Calvinists and the Arminians stress faith. But what does faith mean here? For Calvin, faith is really the result of God's election. Okay, you end up having faith. That's a sign of salvation, he says, but it's not causally. It's an effect that is not cause. Whereas for Arminius, well, faith in at least this minimal sense of acceptance is actually a cause. So this really plays a causal role. So think of the things we're listing as playing a causal role. For Calvin, faith is an effect, and then works are an effect of that. But it doesn't play a sort of causal role, whereas for Arminius it really does. So there is this degree of acceptance required. The hand is stretched out to everyone for Arminius, and actually Calvin agrees with that. In a sense, the hand is stretched out to everyone. It's just that some people will not choose to grasp it. And he says it's ultimately God's giving you a nature that either enables you to grasp it or not, or inclines you to grasp it or not. And so it's really God in the end who gives you that. Whereas Arminius says, well, no, there's really a level of freedom where you are free to accept or reject. Yeah.
I was going to say, and to point out an underlying distinction between the two, the God's choice part on the Arminian perspective, a lot of times I've heard it described as it was his predestination based on his foreknowledge, whereas, a Calvinist, at least in the Protestant sense, would say it was God choosing to awaken you. It was an action on God's part. The Arminian would come back and say, okay, well, yes, it was election, but he looked ahead, saw who would choose him, and then elected those people. So it's a lot more passive than a Calvinist would get into.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I think that, I hesitate to say the Arminian position just because I think Arminius is one of many of these kinds of single predestination questions, but within that position, it's not just predestination, it's also a matter of a kind of an overabundant grace. So irresistible grace, TULIP is an acronym that comes up later. It's not Calvin necessarily.
Calvin didn't believe tulip.
I mean,
No, right, he did.
and so, but the idea is that God has a kind of superabundant grace. He gives to the great, to the just, and to the unjust. And grace is just a gift, and you can take it or you don't have to take it. But part of what makes God the greatest God ever is the fact that He can give, and people can take it or not. Doesn't matter to Him.
Right. Yeah. No. Exactly. Yeah.
You solve the Pharaoh's question that way. There are a lot of people who ask, how did Pharaoh's heart get hardened, and therefore was he responsible for all the plagues that came upon him? And the classical answer is that he already had that predisposition. He had no desire to go to allow Israel to be free or to acknowledge the God of Israel. So God has merely reinforced that tendency. Said, well, if you're already hard of heart, I'll make sure you're hard of heart. Choose one side or the other.
Right. Yes, exactly. There are several interesting test cases for these views, and that is one of them, where people think about that kind of case and say, yeah, okay, to what extent is it Pharaoh's responsibility then, and to what extent is it God's? So one reason that people fight a lot about these is that this is at least something that makes you responsible from an Arminian point of view. Now we can explain how there is some free choice in your part, and so you were rightly assigned responsibility. Whereas on this view, the Arminian charges, it's hard to see why you're morally responsible for anything, since you actually played a causal role. Now, there is an Augustinian slash Molinist position, which says, well, yes, it's God's choice. And indeed, at the end of his life, Augustine becomes more and more stressing the God's choice aspect. But it's for a reason, okay? And it has to do with this foreknowledge. It's God's choice, but based on something, based on foreknowledge. So God knows what you're like, and knows at the moment of creation what you will do under various circumstances, and judges on that basis. So before you actually make the choices, God knows what you're going to choose. And so you are, from the beginning of time, saved or condemned, but it's really not, it's not that, how can I put it? It's through God's action. On the other hand, it's because God knows what you will do. So what you will do, what you will freely choose, ends up playing some causal role. Yeah?
Who was Arminian? Was he a reformer?
Yes.
He was a Dutch reformer, and so he's considered to be one of the major non-Calvinistic positions in the 17th century. But you also kind of end up having the Cambridge Platonists who are not Calvinistic. And by the 18th century, you're going to also have John Wesley, who's going to revive the doctrine of prevenient grace, which is this concept that you have grace that kind of comes before, that prepares you to accept the grace when you receive it.
Right, yeah, once you think, look, it's a question of God's choice, or God's grace, to put it slightly differently, but then some attitude of acceptance in your part. There's a lot you can say about the ways in which they interact, and so it gets, that's part of the reason it gets very complicated.
I mean, it's very similar to the idea that justification establishes a cooperation between God's grace and man's freedom. So he's just sounded very, it doesn't sound like he's reacting to anything orthodox or by the Catholic.
I think what Arminius is trying to do is find a middle ground between something like those positions, what he perceives as the Catholic position and the Calvinist position.
And I think part of that's going to be that there's something real that happens with that initial choice. So there's a concern within a lot of Catholic theology, it's not all of it, but it's definitely perceived, that you have to keep making that choice in order to stay in the kingdom somehow. And that's not necessarily the position, but Arminius and Arminians are going to try to have this concept of all you have to do is step on the airplane and then God's piloting. Like, you don't have to worry about falling out of the airplane unless you run and open the door and jump out, right? Like, this is, you have to do a lot to get out off of that airplane. And so they're really concerned about maybe you don't you can resist the grace, but it's not like it's going to be super easy to lose your salvation, I guess is the concern.
Right, good. If these people reject the irresistible grace idea, what about the persistence of the saints? You can think of acceptance as a once and for all deal, but typically they don't. They think it's something that has to be sustained, but it may be harder or easier to sustain. So think again of the cat analogy. The cat actually fits this well, because after all, you don't ask for the cat's acceptance. It's not like you say, do you agree? I mean, with a child above a certain age, probably, I guess that the child's acceptance is relevant to adoption, but for a baby or for a cat, I mean, baby doesn't have the right to reject you as a baby. No, I hate your hair. I refuse to have her as my body or whatever. And so, it's sort of like, yeah, to what extent do we have the ability to accept? But then, can we run away? And so there are different kinds of answers you can give to that question. Now, there is a view that Augustine and also Calvin are very concerned to oppose, which is the Pelagian view. Pelagius was an ancient layman, actually, from, well, the British Isles somewhere. It's disputed whether he was British, Scottish, or Irish. But in any case, and this means basically sailor or seagoer, so he's thought to have some connection to navigation in his profession. But anyway, he was a very eloquent person, and he argued that actually all of these things are wrong. That in fact, and now he's really got a very common sense view. What gets you into heaven? What do you have to do to get into heaven? Actually, when the rich young man asked Jesus, what does Jesus say? Does he say, well, it's really turned from the beginning of the world? No, what does Jesus tell him? Yeah.
He's actually, first he gives him the commandments. Have you done this, and this? And then the rich man's like, yeah, I have. And then he goes, well, there is still one more thing you have to do, which is to take the cross and follow me.
Right.
After selling your possessions.
And so what is he looking for?
Good word.
Right. Maybe in combination with that. So the thought is here, look, it's really actions. Perhaps in combination with faith, perhaps not. That's what gets you in heaven. Okay? It's a matter of what you do. Do you sin or not? Now, the Calvinists and Augustine, let's consider, well, we all fail. I mean, they both refer to Paul and say, look, we're judged by the law, we're all sons. And sometimes it's because, look, there are certain things like thou shalt not covet, God can't fulfill. Calvin really says we're so tainted, so corrupted, that even a good action is really tainted. I do something, a work of charity, and it's never not admixed with some selfish motive. And so from Calvin's point of view, even the best human actions, judged by themselves, are still unworthy. But Pelagius says, no, it's really actions together with faith. And so, but now, why do Calvin and Augustine oppose this? Sorry, I've been reading all this Latin poetry, Horace and so on, so I'm getting myself very confused. But you might think, look, this leaves God's grace out of the equation. This leaves God's choice. And then there's a view known as semi-Pelagian, which basically says, well, these aren't sufficient, but they are necessary. And so the semi-Pelagian view is really that, well, at least actions and faith are part of the story, then maybe there's other stuff. Okay? So they are necessary components, they aren't by themselves sufficient. Yeah.
I've actually heard this position. It's the most common response to faith dilemma, reconciling James and Paul.
It is very common.
Necessary but not sufficient. I think
Right. Now, part of the reason is you can interpret this in this way. You can say, based on foreknowledge, well, of what? Of faith and acts, right? And so sometimes it's just an expression of this position, but it really, the Pelagian attitudes and semi-Pelagian attitudes are still quite common. Anyway, next time we will review for the final exam.